This is the game of politics. This is why I think democracy is by far the best system of governance. And as a bonus, I'll throw in 2 ways to improve it at the end. Before we start looking at democracy, it's important to look at the state. Just like any organisation, money flows in and money flows out. It is the outflow that we're going to focus on in this video. It is important to remember this is a limited amount. We'll leave government debt for another video. So the basic principle that all leaders must remember is they must use that finite amount of money in the most efficient way possible to try and keep power. With the limited amount of money, it is important that a leader defines who the key supporters are. But what are key supporters? Key supporters are the people or the groups of people that a leader needs to keep on side in order to stay in power. In a democracy, there are many key supporters that you need to gain or hold power. These are usually divided into demographic groups, like age, in order to make it easier for politicians to target them. For example, if a politician wants to target the elderly, they may build more care homes or increase healthcare spending. Whereas in a dictatorship, there's a very small number of key supporters. These may be a few civil servants, a general or two, a chief of police. So in summary, a democracy has a large coalition of key supporters. Got a small number of people to keep happy? Well, that's good for a leader because they can afford to give a large reward to the smaller group of people. However, in a large coalition system, inherently the rewards must be spread across more people. It would be impossible just to bribe vast numbers of voters. So a leader in a democracy must spend on things like public services or infrastructure. This keeps enough people happy in order for them to stay in power. Life for people in a small coalition system is generally bad. A leader may build some infrastructure and may provide some public services, but in general, a leader doesn't want to spend on those things because it takes money directly from the key supporters, whose loyalty it is necessary to buy. This generally leads to a miserable life for anybody living in a small coalition system. However, there are exceptions, like Brunei. Oil money! But the clear majority of wealthier countries are democracies. Life in a large coalition system is generally a lot better for the citizen. Leaders need to spend their money on things to gain support of their citizens. But what do the leaders spend their money on? Here leads to a phenomenon that I'm going to call the prosperity effect. This is the idea that when a leader spends money on things like education, healthcare, and infrastructure, it increases the productivity of the people. On a basic level, this makes sense. If a citizen is too uneducated to work, too ill to work, or simply can't get to work, then they're not going to be as productive. This increased productivity then leads to increased tax revenue, which means that those same government officials can then spend more money on public services. This leads to a positive cycle. Looking at the top 30 countries in terms of GDP per capita, 77% of these are modern liberal democracies. The other 23% are small coalition systems, but they're also rolling in oil money, like Saudi Arabia. In a large coalition system, we tend to see a larger amount of freedoms for the citizens, like freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. But what is the reason for that? The answer is simple. It increases productivity. If people can gather to share ideas, they can find the most efficient way to solve a problem. A free press can find instances of corruption, which in a democracy is a parasite because it takes money away from the key supporters. But not just in government, the press finds corruption and bribery within the business world as well. Also, on a basic level, voters like freedom, so a candidate that advocates for greater freedom is likely to gain votes. People living under a large coalition system are generally going to be much better off than people living in a small coalition system with freer and more prosperous lives. I feel it's clear by now that a large coalition system is much better for the average citizen. The only question now is how to improve democracy to increase the prosperity for all of the citizens. There's a couple of things that could be done. The first being a proportional representation voting system. This would force larger coalitions to be formed, which would therefore spread public goods a lot further. For example, in my country of the UK, a winning coalition can consist of as little as 34 to 35% of the vote voting population, whereas in proportional representation you need at least 51% of the voting population. So in a PR system, politicians would need to target public services towards at least 51% of the voting population. Secondly, a thing that can make a huge difference to the prosperity of a nation could be mandatory voting. This would increase the coalition size vastly and means a politician simply can't ignore a demographic that doesn't usually vote, like the poor or young people. The idea for this video, and for my channel in fact, came from an amazing book called The Dictator's Handbook by Alistair Smith and Bruce de Mesquita, which I believe is one of the best books on politics ever written. I became aware of this book while watching CPG Gray's 2 videos on rules for rulers, and I highly recommend you go and watch those. I'll leave a link down in the description for them, and if I remember, I'll put a link up on screen. This has been The Game of Politics, and thank you for watching.